I was really excited when I started hearing about this game that we're going to look at today, Aventuria, adventure card game. And I was excited about it because it offered the promise of things I like so much in games, which are adventuring and variable play dictated by cards and characters and an RPG element to the game in addition to combat. And I was fortunate enough to get a copy of this game from the publishers, and I'm going to show it to you here. Taking a quick look at the back of the box, it is described as a fast-paced card game for 1 to 4 players, and every player takes control of a hero of Aventuria. Aventuria is a hazardous place where all kinds of dangers lurk behind every corner. Collect your weapons, armor, and magic spells, learn special talents and unique abilities, and surprise your opponent with unexpected tricks. It plays in 2 different ways. There's the duel mode where the heroes can fight against each other, and then there's a co-op adventure mode where the heroes are banding together to overcome challenging adventures as a group. In terms of the game contents, most of which I'll show you here, we have a bunch of cards, many counters, hero counters, life point counters, fate point counters, 8 dice. There's some custom dice. There's a D6, which has the dark eye in place of the 6 value, and then there are a D20s as well, with the eye in place of the 1 value. Each hero gets a pair of 1d6 and 1d20, and they're used throughout the game for various things. We also get adventure cards, of course, with our leaders and henchmen and rewards and all sorts of other things that are used for actions. And we also get a hero document pad, because during the course of the adventures in the game, you can possibly choose, as you have successes through the adventure mode, to level up from your initial starting values, and we'll talk about that later on. So you get a nice hero pad and a place to note any reward cards that you may have picked up. One of the great things about this game that is worth mentioning from the outset is the fact that it is very easy to start to play it. I found the rules to be quite clear, and the iconography on the cards to be quite clear, and even the basic setup to be quite easy. And those are 3 things that I wish I could say more about more games in this vein that I play. Typically that's not the case, but here it is. And I want to start by showing you one of the heroes here, because what's interesting is that each of the heroes has 2 cards. And the card on the right is the basic card describing this is a half-elf rogue character. His name is Carolyn Calavanti, and he has the abbreviation HR on here for, I guess, half rogue. His deck of cards, his starting deck of cards, is all marked very clearly with the HR. He gets 30 cards to start. Every character does. And if you wish, though there are rules for building your own deck, you can, right out of the box, just pull out all the cards marked with the particular character's abbreviation and get going that way. That is a wonderful thing because it makes, again, the start time pretty quick. In terms of the basic values on the card on the right here, I'll show this to you maybe a little more clearly. Here we have, there are 3 types of combat that can occur in the game. There's close combat, indicated by this icon here of the sword or knife. There's ranged combat, indicated by this bow and arrow. And then there's magic combat. This guy actually has no magic combat value. There's also a dodge number here, and this takes effect if you are going to be receiving some wounds in combat. Before the wounds are assigned, you can roll for your dodge value, and if you roll at or below your number, and all of these numbers and values are rolling at or below for success, you will cut in half the number of wounds that you would have received. Everybody comes with a basic attack value or something basic that they can do. He has a knife here, and I'll explain what this means in a moment, but this is a close combat attack, and the wounds dealt are 1d6 worth of wounds. Everybody also comes with a special ability, and it is available to be used once during the game. In his case, he gets to prevent all wounds from some attack after he successfully dodged it. So I mentioned if you dodge something, you are cutting the number of wounds in half. In his case, if he wants to get rid of all of them altogether, he can use his special ability once during the game. Once he has used that, you then flip the card over. These values are all the same, but it indicates here that the value, his alertness special ability, has already been used. The second card that is present for the heroes are sets of skills and value numbers for skills. This is only used in the adventure mode, so I'll talk about that when we talk about the adventure mode. The back of this card is indicating what types of card categories can be placed in his hand if you choose to build a deck for yourself. And these icons, which are explained here, appear on all of the cards that are available to you to build a deck. So you can see here in the lower left the indication of the icon, for example, for a talent, and it also says talent. So once again, the effective use of an icon, but also just explaining to you with actual words what it is. So it really reduces the amount of time that you need to spend looking things up as well as remembering them. The deck of cards that you have to play with represent everything, all the actions that your hero can take, whether it is combat actions with weapons or combat actions with movement, like this feint action, or various attributes that you can use either permanently or as a one-time use to enhance your character. So I'm going to go over some of them, and I just want to make explicit here, I'm going over what I think to be enough of the rules to explain the game, to give a feel for the game, but this is not a tutorial video. I don't do tutorial videos. Other people do those excellently. I'm trying to give a rules overview and highlight highlight what I think are enough of the rules to give you a sense about whether this might be a game for you and how it plays in general. So that being said, let me say now that there are two types of cards that are available to you in your deck. The ones with the red background here are called one-off cards, and they are basically, you can use them one time and then they need to be discarded. And the black bordered ones are permanent cards, so you place them in your player area and they become, say in this case, this is an armor, a quilted surcoat, that you place and you have it with you permanently. In the case of this particular card, you need to tap it, and we'll get into that. Tap is not the word they use, but in effect tap it to get the benefit, which is a 2 value of protection. Now in this case, apparently you can also discard it to reduce an attack weapon by, or attack value by, an additional 3 points if you discard it. So in this case it's sort of both, but here this would be a one-time use only card, which you would, if you were playing in the duel mode, you would prohibit your opponent from playing action cards the next turn. That's actually pretty good. I've never used that one. Some cards have 2 different values. In the adventure mode, since you are playing co-op, you wouldn't want to play a card against an opponent. You would, in this case, play it against the Henchmen, and in that case you are allowed to direct the Henchman's attack against whichever hero you choose, and presumably your party would choose that together, maybe the person with the least current wounds or whatever. But this is a one-time use card. Now, every card has a number here in the upper left that you see, this 3 in the circle and this 2 in the circle. These are known as the endurance cost of the card. The central mechanic of this game is that in order to play cards, you need to pay for cards, and you are paying for cards with cards from your hand. Once you assign cards from your hand to be endurance cards, you cannot get them back, typically. There are some cards that allow them to come back into your hand, but they're not coming back by choice. They're coming back randomly, and they're typically coming back when you don't want them to come back, because once you lose them, you then can't pay for more expensive cards. So when you assign a card as an endurance, which I'll show when I get into an opening hand, you have to sort of assume it's out of the game. This forces constant anguish during the course of the game in terms of, am I going to sacrifice a card to use it to pay for other cards or not? So that is very effectively implemented as the central way of gaining cards to use for your actions. The other things, I already mentioned this kind of shorthand for hero to assign the card to a deck. This is the name of what it is, and then the effects are described here, and then of course there's always some flavor text, and this game I think is meant to have, or will have, or does have expansions, and so this A indicates it comes from this set. In the adventure mode of the game, you are playing against enemies, and here is an example of one of the henchmen. They have a different back, a henchman card that you might be playing against, and we'll just take a look quickly at how this works. Each of the henchman cards has a different name. This is an orc archer, and they also have certain characteristics or keywords on the card, and these are typically used based on the rules that might tell you, for example, for this adventure, pull all the cards with the bandit keyword or something of that nature. Each of the henchmen also has what they call an action table, and you are rolling a d20 at the beginning of the turn for the henchmen to determine what they are going to do. And based on that roll, for example, they might do a long-ranged attack, and the person in the party designated as the current starting hero is going to have to suffer this many wounds. So it is a kind of random, within the table of the card, a random attack that might happen, and it's possible you may escape without an attack value if you roll one of these things. There are something called threat points for the henchmen, and that is represented by this number here in the small black circle. The adventure is going to tell you, it's going to scale up depending on how many heroes you have doing the adventure. So it may tell you that for each hero in the game you choose up to 5 or 10 or whatever threat points for the henchmen that appear at the beginning of the game. So with the more heroes you have, the more henchmen you're going to be facing. This is their starting life point value, which can change both negative or positive during the course of the adventure. This is the same dodge value as you have that I described earlier. It works in the same way, so that when you are making a successful attack, well, in this case, your orc, you know, he's an orc. He can't really dodge anything, but if he had a dodge value before your damage was assigned, he would roll for that to see whether he could cut that in half. This is the value of the armor that he is currently wearing, which can absorb some damage points, and this is the number of actions that he can take per turn. There are also, of course, leaders, and this is the name of one of the Act 1 of one of the adventures in the base game. This is a 3-act adventure, and the full adventures are 3 acts. And what this is directed is the leader of these henchmen, and there is some rule here. In this case, it says this leader can only be attacked when there are fewer henchmen in play than heroes, and this is the symbol for heroes. So in this particular case, when you're facing, say, this leader and he's got 3 or 4 of his henchmen out, depending on how big your party is, you have to completely annihilate a certain number of henchmen before you can even get to him. His life value also scales. So again, this represents the number of members in the party. If you had 2 members in your party, he would have a starting life of 10, etc. Similar type of special rules that he has that explains what he does based on a d20 roll. He also has the dodge value. In this case, if he rolls a 6 or below, your attack will be cut in half. He has an armor value of 2, and his actions are based also on the size of your party, so this will scale in that manner too. If you're going through the adventure with 2 heroes, he gets 2 actions, 3, he gets 3, etc. So that is an example of the leader card. The other way in which the game can scale is through the use of these time scale cards. And this is the easy value. There's easy, normal, I think difficult, and legendary. And basically what this means is that at the start of each round of combat, you have a certain number of time counters represented by this hourglass. And at the end of each combat, you remove one. When you start to get lower and lower, certain things happen. So, for example, when there are only 6 time left, an event happens. And as you can imagine, this is an adventure game, so events are not going to be great. When you get down to 5, you have to bring in a new henchman, etc. So it gets worse and worse as the time goes, and to scale it back, so the normal value, you're starting with 7 time as opposed to, say, 8. Whoops. And I think the effects are the same on that, but you have the capacity to have these different modes. So at the beginning of your adventure, you're choosing the mode that you want to use. I'm going to use the rule book both to go over a couple of other points that I didn't mention, and also just to show you the example of what I think is just a great rule book. It's really very clear, and as I said earlier in the video, it seems like such a basic thing, but I just find in so many games this is not the case. So the rulebook begins by presenting you with the duel rules, and that is, as I mentioned, the head-to-head action, the head-to-head combat action, and they say that, and accurately, that understanding this is the core to the game. So even if you're going to play in adventure mode, it's important to start with the duel rules, and I will show you a demonstration of what happens in the duel. You've got life counters that are based on the heroes, and you typically start at 40 life. You have other hero counters and something called fate points that come with these discs that we will talk about. They're showing you what the cards are. Very clear example of how to play, what to do to start the turn. It's a big rule book. It's the size of the box, so it's laid out quite nicely, quite clear explanation of the values on the cards. They give you an example of, almost too big an example of the basic layout of how you are meant to have a draw pile and use your endurance cards, an explanation of your actions, and a little bit of an example of what the game might look like. The explanation of combat is fairly detailed with some examples within to let you know how it works. There's some flavor text here as well. And I mentioned that sorry about that noise, I'm having some work done in the apartment. There is the capacity to build your own deck of cards, and they give you some examples here if you want to put together your own 30-card action deck and not just use the pre-made deck. Here is a deck from a different character, again matching all these values up, and what they will tell you and show you is the types of cards that the characters can have, because the characters have different strengths and weaknesses. So for example, one of them may have way more capacity to do magic than another, who this character, as I showed you earlier, has no magic at all. And so even if you're not building your own deck, you can look. Sorry about that. So, for example, we can take a comparison look here at these characters. This blacksmith, dwarf blacksmith, this is Arbosh here, and he's basically a very strong fighter, as you can see, both by the number of potential cards that he could have in terms of heavy weapons, as compared to the other characters, and then also on his stats here. So his high stat here for close combat as well as for ranged combat, and he actually has no magic ability. And you can contrast that to the mage, the Tulamidian mage here. I won't even try to pronounce her actual name. You can see her magic value is 14. And likewise, if we look here, matching up her picture to her stats here, if we look at the allowable cards, she is the one that gets the most by far of the potential magic spell cards, and she has far fewer allowable cards in the weapons area. So this is helpful as a quick reference in terms of what the characters are if you want to get going with a character who has a certain strength without looking through all and ascertaining exactly what those 30 cards are. You can easily do that, and of course if you're going to get into deck building for playing the game, you would be following these rules. There is a very useful and helpful summary of the game turns. I wish that that had actually come on a card as well, because that would be a little bit more useful. Since the rule book is so good, you don't actually need to, I didn't need to really be referring to it too much, but I did need to have it out because, excuse me, this is where the turn summary was, and I wish that it had been on a card. The game symbols are listed here again. They are also indicated on the cards, and they match up pretty quickly and easily because there just aren't too many of them to remember. The next part of the rule book goes over the adventure rules, and I will talk about those later on, but it is clearly written as the earlier part of the rule book, and then toward the back of the rulebook are the adventures that you get. So when you purchase the base game, you get a short adventure here, Saving Sylvana, that is in one act, and then you get one longer adventure, which is the Legacy of Wildenstein, and that is in 3 acts. And I'm not going to show you the flavor text or adventure there, so I don't ruin the surprise, but I'll talk about that later on. There is another summary here. Let's see. There's another summary here at the back of game symbols and some additional symbols that come into play with the adventure mode and the summary of the adventure mode actions. So overall, just a fantastic, well-organized, clearly written, you know, there's some artwork here design-wise that gives you the sense that this is an old thing, and I see a lot of games try to do this, but then they make the whole text dark and you can't read it, but here they do it really effectively, so it feels like it's thematic but very clearly written, and overall I really appreciate that. Setup for the duel mode is really easy. We've got the draw deck for our mage that we're playing, and we've got the draw deck for the blacksmith. I'm using these 2 characters because they have pretty different abilities, and I think it's a good chance to give you a look at some of the cards and how they would impact combat. Again, in this example, we're going to be fighting each other to show you the mechanics of the combat. The combat works the same basically in the adventure mode as well. These are our life point counters. They begin at 40, and these are the D20 and the D6. Each one gets a set, but obviously I'm both, so we're just using one set. These are the fate counters. There are 2 fate counters in the game per player, so we begin with 4, and they have various effects in the game, and in the duel mode, the effects allow you, for example, if you have a fate counter, you can use a fate counter to draw a card if you discard one. You could also gain an additional endurance card by discarding one, and you could also re-roll an attack. So they give a benefit. What you're meant to do with these player counters is to randomize them and just choose one at the beginning of the game, which I will do, and the one that is chosen goes first, and then the other one gets a fate counter. So I guess that is compensation for not going first. So we will choose this one as the person to go first, and that is our mage, and that means that our dwarven blacksmith will start the game with a fate counter, and there are other ways in the context of the game to earn fate counters, so they will both be able to potentially earn fate counters to use later in the game. This is the counter that is meant to be used in the adventuring way of playing to indicate the lead character, but I'm going to use it here just to keep track of whose turn it is. So I will place it here to indicate she's going first. This is currently her turn to go first, and we'll move it back and forth. But in the actual way, if you were playing 2-player, this would not be used here. Otherwise, this is the basic setup for the duel mode. Play begins by drawing up your hand of 5 cards. This is from your randomized draw deck, and we will be taking a look at these 5 cards to see what we get and the effects, remembering that the black bordered ones are permanent cards and the red bordered ones are instants. The number in the circle, again, are the endurance value in order to play the card. Right now, nobody has any endurance cards played out, but we will be doing that in a next mode, in the next part of this game. But right now we're just going to examine our cards. So we have here a pretty nice attack card. Remember, our mage here is really focusing on the magic attack. You can make one of each type of attack in a game as long as you can pay for the attack with a card with endurance. But in reality, it's very difficult until later in the game to do 2 or certainly 3 types of attacks because you just don't have the endurance cards built up yet. But we see here her magic combat value is pretty high, 14. So she needs to roll on a d20 a 14 or less for success. So that's pretty good. So we're looking here at the effects of this. I won't even try to pronounce it, but it's a spell. Is going to be a wound. That's a 1d6 plus 5. That's pretty good. In order to get this card out, it's going to cost us 5 endurance. And once it is out, we are going to need to pay an additional endurance as well as to tap the card when played. So that is what the cost is, the additional cost every time we want to use it. But we just have to pay 5 to get it out. That's pretty expensive early on in the game, but it has potentially great effects because her magic attack has a high chance of success anyway. We have a talent, a sleight of hand talent, that allows us to add 2 to our ranged combat value, and this is going to be a permanent effect as indicated here. So if we paid the cost of 2 to get it out, we would place it underneath our character card lined up as such to indicate a permanent change to her ranged combat value. So that's a pretty good long-term effect for only the cost of 2. We don't have to keep paying to use it once we put it out once. We have an instant here that allows us to lose health to gain this number in a circle refers to endurance cards. So we would lose a health to gain 2 endurance until the end of the turn. We can only use it once, but it's free. That's a pretty good card. Another instant card is another spell where a magic attack will do an automatic 7 damage. Really like that art. That's a good one. And we have another talent, Magical Lore, that's adding to our already high magic value. That's going to be a permanent addition to it, and it is only going to cost us 3 endurance to get out. So these are some pretty good cards in the starting hand that we've got. The next thing we're going to do is to draw 2 cards from our draw pile into our hand as the next part of the turn. And what we got is, we got another spell, Invocatio Minor. This is a magic attack, and it does 12 damage. That's pretty good. It's going to cost us 4, and we're only going to get to use it once. That's pretty good. And we got some armor. We got a chest plate. Now, the armor is going to be around your body, and you can only equip one, for example, chest armor or whatever at a time. So you can switch it out, but you have to pay the cost, for the new card. And this is a Covenant Garb. We get to draw 1 card from our draw pile when our hero loses health from an opponent's attack. That's pretty good. It only costs 2. So now we have a decision to make, and this is the endurance card part of the turn. If we had endurance cards out already that had been tapped, we would be readying them now. But this is the first turn of the game. So what we can do is we can play up to 2 endurance cards in this part of the turn. And playing an endurance card is simply taking one of your action cards, turning it upside down, and placing it down and designating it as endurance card. You don't get to look at it again, and it is rare for it to ever come back into your hand. If it does come back into your hand, it is as a result of something. I don't know whether that happens in duel mode. It definitely happens in adventure mode. It's a randomly chosen card that comes back into your hand, and then you're in effect losing it as an endurance. So for all intents and purposes, you have to assume its value as anything but an endurance card, as a mechanism to allow you to play other cards, is gone. So we have some choices to make as to what we're going to do. It being the first turn of the game, we may think, well, we could, it's going to be a while before we build up 5 endurance cards. You can only play a maximum of 2 each turn, and sometimes there are going to be cards you just don't even want to play. So it's going to take us a while to play this particular card. However, it is a spell, a permanent spell that we can keep reusing, and it's going to give us a 1d6 plus 5 magic damage. That's pretty good, so I'm really hesitant to waste that as an endurance, not waste it, but to expend it as an endurance card. We have a minor spell here, but this only is a one-time use. It costs us 4, but it does 12. Again, pretty good, but it's only one time. I do tend to give up one-time use cards when I draw them so early on, but I don't know about that one. I like that one a lot. When I have it in my hand, I find myself always working up my endurance to use it. I like the protection. Now, this is a permanent effect onto our ranged attack, which is only 8. So that'll bring us up to 10. Obviously, we're rolling on a d20. We need to hit a 10 in this case, or lower, or an 8 or lower. I mean, that's pretty good, but remember, we do need to be able to pay for more than one attack. We're certainly going to use our magic attack first when we do attack, because that's our strength. So the question is, how much are we going to really end up ever using a ranged attack or being able to? This is a candidate for getting rid of, I think, even though it's a permanent effect. This instant, losing a health to gain +2 to the end of the turn, that's great, but you can only do it once, and I might give that up, even though it's free to use. Let's see, we have another minor spell. This is going to cost us 2 to do 7 damage, as opposed to paying 4 to do 12 damage. So, let's see, I lost track of where we are. Magical lore. This is adding 3 to our already high magic value. This is always a question when I play this character, because it's costing me 3. I'm getting even higher, but I'm already pretty high, so I don't know. I probably will keep that. I think I've shown you all the cards, I hope. And let me think about it and tell you what I decide. I've decided I'm going to go with what I think the cards are telling me to do. I'm going to actually hang on to this. I thought I was going to get rid of it. I'm going to hang on to it to use the benefit at some point to gain 2 endurance early on to get this number 5 cost spell out, because I really like the ongoing wounds that it's going to allow me to deal. I'm also going to hang on to my permanent boost in magic, and I am definitely hanging on to this spell. Even though it's not as efficient as this one, I think I'm going to be all right, and to hang on to a 4 endurance card early on in the game, I think it's going to be cluttering my hand. So I'm going to use that as one of my endurance cards, and the other one I'm going to be using is this. Possibly a mistake, but I feel that I'm going to be going with my magic and magic and magic, and I'm going to be giving this up. So I'm going to choose to turn these over and turn them into endurance points for my later use. Thus, my hand remains here. These cards are all designed more or less to work together, and I've got this card that I feel is valuable to me, knowing how the game plays. I'm going to be wounded, and I really like to cycle as many cards into my hand as possible. So that's why I made that choice. Now, at this point, I can do an action, and I have 2 endurance points to spend, so I could play this card, which is an instant spell, and do an attack there. I could play down my armor, or I could play this card to give me 2 more endurance points until the end of the turn, giving me a total of 4. I'm certainly not going to do that because there's nothing that costs me for, I want to get this out, but it costs 5, so I don't have enough, and I'm certainly not going to play this and waste it just to get out something that only costs 3. So really the choice is to play out one of these 2 cards, or I could do an attack because I have an inherent ability here, as does everybody, and I have a basic equipment, and with my basic equipment I can make a magic attack and do a 1d6 damage. To do this attack, what do I need? I need 1 endurance point, and I need to tap this card out. So I'm going to do that. You don't have to use all of your available endurance cards per turn, and partially to show you how it works, and whoops, this belongs over here, partially to show you how it works, and partially because that's probably what I would do anyway, I'm going to do this. So what this means is I'm going to spend my endurance card, the required amount here, and then I'm going to tap this out to do a magic attack. I'm rolling on my current magic value, which is 14. Now again, remember, once I get this card played out here, this is going to be my magical lore. It's going to permanently raise my magic stat, but I don't have it played out yet. So I'm just operating with my base magic ability, and I'm taking this d20, and I'm looking to roll a 14 or less to be a successful magic attack. And if I am successful, then I will roll that d6 to see how successful I am. So we got a 6. So we did do a successful attack against this dwarven blacksmith right here. And the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to roll this d6, and it tells us that we're going to do 1d6 worth of damage, potentially. So we got the I, and the I in this die is a 6. So potentially we're doing 6 points of damage. Now, I say potentially because I guess the eye goes like that. You remember that the characters have a dodge value. His dodge value is 5. So at a 5 or less on a d20, he is going to successfully dodge this attack and reduce the amount by half down to 3. So we'll see how lucky he is to see what he gets. And wow, he did get it. He matched his value, and therefore, unfortunately, instead of doing our 6, we only do 3 points. So beginning of the game, we all have 40 life points, so his life value goes down to 37. And that is the end of our portion of the turn and our attack against him. I really still can't believe this dwarven blacksmith dodged my magic attack. I mean, look at this fellow. He does not look very acrobatic, but such as it goes. That never happens when I'm playing off camera. In any event, now it is his turn. So because we're playing both, just to remind us, we'll put this over here. Remember, he's got this fate token that he can use, and his turn begins in the same manner. He's going to be drawing his initial starting hand of 5 cards, and we'll take a close look at them to give you a sense of what he's got here. Gangrene. This is a free action, meaning it could be played at any time. That's indicated down here. Pick an opponent that lost at least 5 health from an attack. That opponent loses 1 health at the beginning of every turn. That's really good. I haven't seen that card before. We got a Warhammer. It's expensive. It costs us 6, but and it's 6 to place, and then it costs us 1 more endurance card to tap it out to use it to do our close hand-to-hand combat attack. It also has another cost in effect. You see this symbol here under the attack. It says attack -2. What that means is it's actually harder for us to use it than our regular value would suggest. We need to subtract 2. I can't find my hero card right now, but for our test, in order to use it, we have to subtract 2 from our basic value to start with, but it does 2d6 plus 3 worth of damage if we are successful. So that's a lot, and that's a good card to have. Oh, here we are. He's in here. All right. I think I was trying to show this. So if we place this Warhammer, in addition to the endurance cost and the additional endurance once it's down, we would be rolling not against our native value, our native close combat value of 14, but a value of 12, thus making it even a little harder. You know, it's a heavy thing to wield, but if we're successful, it's going to do a lot of damage. So that's something I don't know that I would want to get rid of. We have an advantage card here, which is Resolute, and it says if our own health drops to 0, we can discard this card and reset ourselves to 1 health. Yeah, I don't know. That's probably, I don't love this card. Do you hang on to it forever? And I'm probably going to use that as an endurance card for sure, regardless of what I end up drawing. Just never really loved that one. We have a throwing hatchet. It is one-time use. That makes sense. We're tossing it, and it costs us 1 endurance. We need to do a test. Now, we haven't seen this before as an example, but what this means is we need to make a test and roll a d20, and we have to get a result equal to or lower than the value of whatever attribute that is. So in this case, would be a test against our ranged attribute. Again, it makes thematic sense because you're throwing this hatchet. So in order to use this card, even if we have to pay the endurance cost regardless, but it may or may not be successful. So we need to roll 10 or less on a d20 for it to be a success, and if it is, then an opponent of our choice loses 3 health, and it doesn't count as an attack. So I like that card. We get to do yet another attack with that. Here's another instant card. This is a talent, and we can discard our opponent's talent or advantage of our choice. That's interesting. And I don't know. That's an instant early on. All right, so this is our hand, and the next thing we do is we're going to draw 2 new cards into our hand, take a look at them, and decide what to do. We get here an equipment. This is a one-time use only, the High King's document. It costs us 3 endurance, and a player of our choice, that would be us, gets to draw 3 cards. I like that. And we also get Carousing. I like this card too. This only costs us 1. We need to tap it out when we use it, and we can gain 1 endurance until the end of the turn. This is a permanent, so we could keep doing this each turn, or we could discard it to draw a card, which I would never use it for that personally. I like this card. I like the art on it, but I like the effects of it too. So this is an easier choice for me, I think, than with our mage. I am going to discard the, what did I say here? Going to discard this Resolute. It's a card I never really like, so not discard, excuse me. I'm not discarding it. I'm turning it into an endurance card, but I'm discarding it down as an endurance card for use as an endurance point, and definitely want to keep that. And I am also going to get rid of this Stunning Blow. So I didn't have to do 2, but I am going to do 2, and I'm going to, in the next part of my turn, create 2 endurance points for myself to use. That's the maximum I can do. And now clearly, obviously, that is out, is a possibility to use. These are my, and so is this. So my potential cards, if I want to play one that I could use, I could do Carousing. I can't use this one because I don't have any opponent that this is valid for, so that's out too. So the options are Carousing, or I could attempt to throw this hatchet and see if I could, get in a little extra early wound. It would be 3 points. It would cost me 1 endurance point to do. I could do that, and then I could still use my knife as my native attack, where I would have 1 endurance point left, and maybe I'll do that. Why not? This is a skirmish. We'll show what happens, and we'll see how good she is at dodging. Now, I believe I would be accurate in saying that I cannot, I don't know. I'm going to assume that she cannot dodge this. It says if it's successful, she loses 3 health, period. I think that's the effect of it. So I'm going to assume this is a surprise attack. She can't dodge it. This is a guarantee. If this is wrong, well, so be it. So that is, I think, my decision. My decision is going to be that I've got my 2 endurance, and I'm going to use this instant. I'm going to pay for it with 1 of my endurance cards, and I'm going to do my test to see if it works. We'll hope that my die rolling is lucky, because my ranged value is not so high. It is a 10 value. I shouldn't have me Should not have me in here. So I'm rolling against this value of 10 to see if my throwing hatchet lands. So let's see what we get. And well, now luck was not with us, so that was a fail, and that's it. You know, we wasted that card, but it was a choice we did, so we're going to discard that card. And we still have one endurance point value card to play, so we are going to choose to use this, and we are going to use it with our inherent equipment here, which is the knife, and we spend the cost here, and then we tap this out to do another melee attack with a potential of 1d6 of value. I said another melee attack, and of course that is inaccurate because first of all you can only do one attack of each kind per turn, and secondly the attack that we did with that hatchet that failed was a ranged attack. Of course we tossed it. This, on the other hand, our inherent attack is a melee, which means that we are rolling against a value of 14 as opposed to 10. We're better in close combat to see whether this attack will land. So the first thing we need to do to see if the attack lands with our knife is to roll, and we're looking for a 14 or less. And we got a 14. So I don't know about this rolling here. It's a little too on the edge for me. So this attack is going to land, and it's going to potentially do a 1d6 worth of attack value. So let's see what potentially we could be landing, or how much attack damage we could be doing. We got a 5. Great. Now, she's going to potentially be able to dodge it. So what we need to do is we're looking at her dodge value. She also has a dodge value of 5, rolling on a d20. So she needs to roll a 5 or less to dodge half of that damage. And she does not. She rolls an 18. So she's going to absorb the full 5 points of damage because she doesn't currently have any armor to protect her. Now you may recall that we do have in our hand, but it has not yet been played, this armor, which would give her, when she took wounds, the capacity to draw a card in, and that's probably something I should get out maybe as soon as possible, although as you recall I'm working on getting out this higher value magic card, but you can see right now the benefit to this, because as you get the wounds you're going to be getting an additional card, an additional potential action. So in any event, she doesn't have it out. She's taking the 5 damage, and so this brings her down to 35. Now I will say the quality on the components is really great, but one of the things that is a little bit, these spinners for the wounds are so loose, as you can see me spinning it around, that if you move them slightly, it just, you kind of lose exactly where you are. So you might choose to use some other mechanism, maybe some dice to keep track of it. In any case, she's down to 35, which I'll find on there, and that is the end of his turn. At the end of turns, we're going to be discarding down to 7 cards in our hand, but that is not the case for either character, so there's no discarding to do, and the next turn would begin. What we would be doing here is, now the order is you draw 2 cards from your pile, and then you ready the exhausted cards. If you've played any other games that involve sort of tapping out cards, that's a little, the order is not natural to you, because I think usually you're untapping first and then doing stuff. But in any event, you're drawing 2 cards and you are proceeding, and I just want to take a moment to go through and just see what her draw is, because I want to show you how, in this case, you're working on a kind of longer term plan here. As we talked about with her, we're really working on getting this 5 magic out, which is going to be the basis of hopefully our landing a lot of damage attacks. So let's just draw up and see what we get. The first thing we get is we get another spell, and this only costs 1, and it is a permanent spell. This is actually a good thing to show you. You can choose, once you get this out, you can choose how many endurance cards you are going to assign to this fulminatus thunderbolt. Based on this number, it is going to increase the value of its potential damage. So further choice built into the game this way, and certain cards have this and give you that type of flexibility. So that's nice. I like that one. And we are getting now an instant spell. Pick a hero and pay up to 5 endurance. Restore 2 health for each endurance paid. That's a nice card, but I would be holding this in my hand a long time before I used it. So I know pretty much right away I'm going to use this one as to give me 1 more endurance point. I can spend up to 2 cards. I've got 3 endurance here right now, and again, I'm trying to get to 5 as soon as possible. I can use this right here, which I'm going to do as an instant. I'm not going to put down any more actual endurance cards right now, but I can use this as an instant to lose a health. So I'm going to go down to 34, and I am going to discard this instant to give me 2 endurance until the end of the turn, and 2 plus the 3 is going to be 5, and this is going to allow me to get out into play this great spell that's going to give me potentially a lot of damage for my magic attack. So I'm going to put that in my play area. You can't see it, but it's down there. It's a permanent. It's going to stay there. Just to remind you, to use it, I will need to use it in a future turn. I will need to have 1 endurance to tap, and I can only use it once per turn, so I tap it out. This is going to end my turn because I have now used all my 3 endurance cards that I had, plus the 2 that I got temporarily, or 2 endurance value from that meditation that I did, that arcane meditation. I'm done. I can't use my native attack ability because I have no way of paying for it. You still have to pay for an attack, and that's would cost me 1 endurance and tap out. I don't have any left, so I'm done. That I risked not attacking this turn to get that out. And we would then move over to, well, I forgot to move this, but that would be her turn. Now it's his turn. Again, I'm showing you this. This is designed as 2-player, but this is really, as a solo player, how you start to understand the core mechanic of the combat, which is relevant in the adventures that we'll talk about. So let's just take a look here and see what this fellow gets. Going to draw up at the beginning of his turn. He's going to get a piece of equipment, a protective amulet, which he can place for 2 and discard to prevent the effects of a liturgical chant, spell, or magic attack that has just been played. Well, given who he's facing, this is probably something he wants to hang on to. And the second thing, he's got some throwing daggers. I'm sort of a little shy of this now after my failure with that throwing hatchet, but this is a permanent, so he could play them for 1, and again, it would be a ranged attack for him with his value of 10 for 1d6 plus 1. I don't think that's going to be so great, to be honest with you, and I probably am going to use that to play as an endurance, so that's giving me 3. I definitely want to keep that. I love this card, keeping that. Working on the Warhammer, keeping that. That's a tempting one to discard, and this, that's pretty tempting to keep. I think I'm going to discard this. Again, early on in the game, an instant, it's costing me 3. It's going to clutter up my hand if I hang on to it too long, and I'm going to just hope for better things. I mean, it's great to be able to draw 3 cards once, but I'm working on something bigger here. I need to build up my endurance to get this Warhammer out. So I'm going to play that for my second endurance. I now have 4 endurance points that are out, and that would allow me to get this amulet out. I could get carousing out for 3 and still do an attack. That's probably what I will do. That is probably what I will do. So I can play these 2 cards for a total of 3 endurance. They're cards that I want, a talent and an equipment, and still have, so that would cost me the 3, and I would still have 1 to try another native attack that I have with my knife. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to bring these out into our play area. You can't see it, but they're down there. And we will spend our 3 endurance here. We still have 1 left to use our basic equipment of the knife to do an attack. And I've already showed you how that works, so I'm not going to go through that again, but that would be the next thing that I would do with that character. Even though I'm not doing a playthrough, I played this out off camera, and I just want to show you how it ended up, because the mage prevailed, basically using this spell to great effect. She got it out early on, right after I stopped filming, actually, and she had a couple of turns where she did almost the maximum damage. She did 11 points of damage with it. That our dwarf, you know, he was... listen, he's not an acrobat, he's not a dodger, and he was unable to dodge it, and took a couple of rounds of 11 points of damage. He got out his Warhammer a couple turns later, but he lost. There was a spell she cast that caused him to lose an endurance card, which wasn't good for him, so it delayed his plan to get the Warhammer out. He did land some pretty decent damage with it, but it was just a matter of she got there she got there a turn or two sooner, and ultimately won. So that was how that ended up playing out. Again, that's the 2-player version, but I went into great detail about it because, as we'll see when we talk about the adventure, which I'm going to do next, this combat is really the heart of the game, even in the adventure mode. The setup for the adventure game is a little bit more involved, but not too terribly complicated, and I am showing you here the setup for the adventure Act 1 of Legacy of Wildenstein. I'm not showing you exactly the whole thing, and I'm going to be a little vague when I talk about it because I want this to be a spoiler-free video. So I will just tell you some of the main points. We're showing 2 different characters here than I showed before. We're going to take a look at the half-elk rogue and the Elf Scout, and as you'll notice, the second character card is coming into play. This is the card with the fuller attributes on it, a kind of RPG-like attribute card, and I'll just show you here some of the attributes are body control, craft, knowledge, perception, etc. Some of these may be familiar to those of you who play RPGs, and I'll talk about how these come into play in this adventure in a moment. We have similarly the fate tokens here, and I mentioned when I was going over the cards that we have this time scale card, and the time scale card has these time tokens on it, and as you proceed through rounds of combat you will be removing the time tokens, and then based on the number that are left and based on the time scale that you've chosen, different things will happen. One of the things that can happen is events can happen, and there is an event deck. It's not a very large event deck, but there's an event deck here that you will pull in events, and at the beginning of the adventure, you are instructed as to, again, I'm not going to show you the events, but I can tell you that the events have keywords on them akin to the keywords that are on some of the other cards, and in this case, for this adventure, you're instructed to pull in event cards with the keywords general, or waters, or forest, and then you shuffle those into a draw pile. So you're not using all the event cards you're given, but they are thematic. Additionally, you have your leader here. We took a look at a leader card. I think it was actually this leader card earlier on when I was going over the cards, so I won't review that in detail here. But up at the top here, these are the wound counters for his health, and as mentioned, this scales per number of adventures, so we have 2 adventurers in our party, and we're told that his health is 5 times the number of adventurers in the party. The calling in some henchmen, this is also scaled up in terms of the threat level of the henchmen, and you are told how to do that in the booklet part of the book that gives you the instructions for the setting up your adventure. We have our health spinners here, we have our draw decks here, and there's a card I'm not showing you that comes into play as part of the story. And again, this is where I'm going to avoid showing you the details or discussing the details of the adventure. But I will tell you what happens is you're given some flavor text, and in the case of this adventure, you are meant to randomly decide something that which character gets the effect of something that you read about. and based on that they get a particular card, and they are given a certain additional attribute or characteristic that fits with the narrative of this adventure, and as a result certain things are impacting that. Including, for example, whichever of the party members has this attribute, once that character is defeated, if that character loses a combat, you immediately are defeated. So, the other thing that happens in adventures are the use of these cards. And the way this is played out, there's a little bit of a narrative, a story, and then you are instructed to make a skill roll, basically, against one of the skills. So in this particular adventure, the first skill roll you're making for each hero is against the knowledge skill. So based on some narrative that you're given, you're making a roll against that, and there are different options for success or failure. If you get, you can get a critical success, which is rolling a 1. You can get a success, you can get a failure, or you can get a critical failure, which is rolling a 20. And that will impact the starting values of various things in the game. So in the course of this adventure, you're doing the knowledge roll, you're doing a roll against survival, and you're also doing a roll against perception for both of the characters, or all of the characters. You could be playing with 3 or 4. I'm just set up here to play 2. So that's a little bit of sort of RPG-ish kind of start to the adventure, and it serves to impact certain things, like perhaps, just saying as an example, it could impact your hand size or your draw size, or give you certain benefits or detriments when you're starting. Maybe it impacts your starting health one way or the other. After that happens, basically it is very similar to what I showed you in detail in the duel mode, so I'm not going to go over it because the combat is very, very similar. But what will happen is, instead of combating each other, because you're working together against the enemy, you are dealing with the leader, and you're dealing with his or her, perhaps there are some female aggressors, henchmen. And that is how the combat goes back and forth. The behavior of the opponents is dictated by what is on these cards, and I reviewed that earlier in the video when we took a look specifically at the cards. So in essence, you're rolling d20s to see what the behavior or the attack is going to be of your opponent, and then you're dealing with the results. You're working together to try to defeat the opponents and make your way toward the end of the adventure and victory. In this case, as I said, this adventure has 3 acts. At the end of the first act, if you're successful, you get a benefit, and there are reward cards in the game. Again, I won't show them to you to sort of preserve some of that mystery, but you have choices with experience points that you gain as to whether you are going to add a reward card into your draw pile for the next act, or perhaps enhance one of your basic skill values here. And I showed you the hero pad that you could make notes on that if you chose to do it that way. The last thing I'll say is one difference, relatively significant difference in the rules for the adventure, concerns these fate tokens. In this case, you can use fate points that you may have to re-roll a die in a skill roll that you may make. The other thing I should mention that happens at the end when you complete one act of the adventure is something is called a brief respite happens. So each player can choose one action for each of the time counters that was left at the end of that act. So there's some incentive to move through as quickly as possible. And for each of the time counters that are left, you can either rest and heal 5 wounds. You could do something called prepare, and that means you could choose a permanent card in your deck and use the time counters to place that card for you and use it as a played card in the next combat. Or you could do something called Pray to the Gods, which is where you, in essence, take a fate point for later use. And then after you do all of that, the adventure continues along into the next act. Just want to make a correction. I misspoke earlier. You are gaining experience points at the end of the adventure, not at the end of the act. So when you have successfully finished the last act, you can gain a certain number of experience points. You may use those experience points either to get these reward cards or to permanently raise a skill value on your basic skills here, or some combination thereof. So if you had 4 experience points, you could get 2 reward cards and raise skills, or up to 2 points of raising skills, or just like that. But that happens at the end of the adventure, not at the end of the acts. Now, I haven't covered every single detail about all of the rules, even all of the rules in the adventures, because there are some other cards that can come in. There are chance encounter cards, for example, and there is something, rule that happens when somebody's life points fall below 0, where they become disabled. I'm not going to get into all of that because those details, I think, are not necessary to get more of a sense of the game than I've already given you here. But the meat of the adventure, as I said, is the combat. And if you haven't watched the portion of the video where I talk about how the dueling or how the combat works, you should really do that to round out your understanding of what the adventure mode is like, because in substance, the bulk of it is that combat. As I talk about some of my thoughts about this game, I'm just going to show you some of the cards from a different deck that we haven't really looked through here, just to show you the art and the type of options that these cards have. I think I showed you this Feint card earlier briefly. There's a Pickpocket one, and again, this is a nice example of a multi-use card, because clearly if you're playing opposed, you would use the card one way. Pickpocket, you can take another hero's armor or equipment card from the table. Well, that's awesome, but you're not going to do that if you're playing with somebody. So in an adventure, you get to draw 6 cards total, and then you can decide amongst the players cooperatively who gets to do what. So very good example of a multi-use card here. Now, I was really highly anticipating this game. I just love the concept of, here's Anatomy. This art is pretty funny. Love the concept of card-based adventures and exploring and leveling up characters and that type of experience in a card-based game. And I will say that I was very, very, very satisfied with the experience as it played out. Here's a nice piece of art. I really enjoy the art on the cards. I could say that actually I appreciate the fact that they're easy to read and legible. You could almost have had slightly bigger pieces of art, I think, because there really isn't too much text, but it is a nice balance overall. And that's just one of the things about the game that is so smooth. Here's acrobatics, adding to your hero's dodge ability that you can play, and again, we recall that this would be a permanent addition. This is carousing. I guess every character has the carousing, comes into play nicely. I think we saw this protective amulet already, a longsword. It is just very, very smooth. It is, as I mentioned, the rules are comprehensive, they're easy to follow, the gameplay makes sense, and for a game that offers, here's a healing potion, for a game that offers a lot of decision making and choices pretty much throughout in terms of, because of this mechanic of the endurance cards and which ones you're going to commit to that function in the game, and then the further choice, for example, within that with cards like this of how many of them, or how many in this case you're going to draw to get an effect. There are a lot of choices without a lot of rules and exceptions and things that make for a complicated game that's hard to get into. The setup, even for the adventures, is not that difficult. You're not having to scroll through or sort through millions of cards, pulling a lot of things out, and overall it is just a smooth playing game, and I really appreciated that. The art is thematic, the way the cards work, as you can see, I think by the examples I'm showing. Here's another type of ranged attack, a throwing knife. They work quite thematically as well. Here is an instant taunt, and I think we saw that before. That's a really great one, basically prohibiting somebody from doing anything the next turn. Now, the downside to the game, I would say, I felt a little bit, we saw this magical lore before, I felt a little bit as if the promise of the adventure was not fully fleshed out. We get these sort of tantalizing cards that we can use, or we think we're going to be using throughout the adventure, with all these different skills, and really that part of it felt a little underdeveloped to me, because again, without going into detail to give it away, what it boils down to is a couple of dice rolls and maybe a little bit use of them throughout the adventure, but I didn't feel that that was as fully developed an aspect of the game as it could have been. That the combat, the elegance of the combat, and the ease of understanding it with the complexity of the decisions was not matched by the adventure portion of it. And by that I mean there's not even locations that you're playing with effects on them. There's no quests to go on, or there's no finding exploration, finding things, picking things up. And I think that that is missing for me a little bit in the game. Ultimately, it didn't matter in terms of my enjoyment of the card play. It simply limited my thorough appreciation of it to the combat aspect as opposed to the story aspect. I think that there would have been, or could have been, ways with the native mechanics built in. You have this card, you've assigned characteristics to these the skills characteristics to these characters. I think more could have been made use of them throughout. The event cards, for example, I wasn't showing you them. I think they could have been more wide. There could have been more of them, first of all. They could have come into play more, and they could have utilized more the potential for the different skills that the characters have. But as an example of how I think the RPG element could have been integrated a little more richly is looking here at one of these Henchmen cards. And again, we see the table that you're rolling on, and they sort of do this automatic attack, and then you have to roll for the result. But what if during the course of the adventure there were ways of questing to gain cards that would allow you to mitigate, for example, the result of this attack? Now, I understand and appreciate the fact that you don't want to have to be manipulating an AI in excess, and if you watch my channel, you know that that's something that really I don't like to do when I'm playing solo. So you don't want to necessarily have to enact all sorts of attack or success on the AI, so I get it. You roll and then they do their successful attack and there's damage, but you could have some more complexity by the ability to play some cards, again, to mitigate that, and maybe those would be adventuring cards that you would pick up as sort of rewards, not necessarily reward gear, but a card that would allow you to fight back in some way and add some complexity in that manner. Just a thought on how I think this could have been developed a little more. It's interesting because I didn't really touch on this, but the Dark Eye itself, as you can see on the side of the box here, is a fantasy role-playing game in Germany, and it was translated into English in the early 2000s, I believe. A very popular German role-playing game, and this comes from that world. So it's sort of funny that in a way it seems that this aspect of it was a little less developed than the strict combat part of it, but maybe that's because the concepts were so fully developed in the actual RPG that they just somehow didn't get translated as effectively here. One point of correction, I note that there are 1 or 2 expansions to this game that have been published. I do not know whether they are published in English yet, but I wasn't sure earlier in the video whether there were expansions, and I see now that there are. But overall, I think if you are somebody that enjoys card-based games and games where you're constantly doing some hand management in terms of, do I do this? Can I sacrifice this? Should I make an effort to hang on to this expensive card here, for example, that I get in my first turn? I really want to be able to do 1d6 plus 5 of damage. How long am I going to hang on to it? How long is it going to take me to commit enough cards to get 5 endurance? If you enjoy that type of gameplay, and certainly if you enjoy the type of art, I think the cards are very lovingly created and thematic, as I mentioned. I think you will enjoy this game. The replay value on it, well, it comes with, as I mentioned, one 3-act adventure and one 1-act adventure in the main box. Now, I think on the Kickstarter there may have been another adventure. I don't really know about that, and I don't know what, if any, plans are for, well, they must have plans for more material in this. There are 4 heroes. They do have different cards and characteristics for the most part, although there's overlap. So you could certainly play through the adventures using different combinations of heroes. If you're playing by yourself, you could also attempt to, say, manage 3 heroes or 4. That would be a bit of a different experience. What would happen, though, at the beginning of the adventure is you're doing these roles. You know, the storyline is going to be, it is already fairly skeletal, and it will become even more so the more you play it, which is why I have omitted any mention of the specifics of the story at all in this video. So that might be a consideration for you if that's your primary motivating factor. But in terms of moving through, you do get reward cards, so you could also continue to play through with the rewards and making some decisions about changing the attributes on your characters as you gain experience. That does add to the replay value. Overall, I found this game to be, I'm going to say, respectfully created. And what I mean by that is respect for the gamer, meaning the rulebook actually works. The attributes on the cards are easy to understand. There are not random symbols that you're constantly having to look up, and I just appreciate that a lot, because there are so many games where I do not see that. In fact, the opposite, I feel, is the case. The combat, I think, is centered on the card manipulation to try to do some card combinations that really work, and not so much, for example, in, you know, positionality, which sometimes can become very fiddly when it's a card game, because in essence it's working with the types of materials that you've chosen for the game. You know, this is not a game of minis, and you're not dealing with that type of positionality. I mean, sure, there's the acrobatic card, but overall you're not trying to deal with a card that really is an effect for a different type of physical component of the game. So it all works together in that way. And these are my thoughts on Aventuria Adventure Card Game, which takes place in the Dark Eye universe. Thanks for watching.